Every morning I'm up by 6 hours. Old routines are stubborn things, especially after living 78 years. I hear the fridge door shut with a thud in the kitchen. Melissa is packing breakfast for her husband, Daniel. About 40 minutes later, she taps on my door not to be polite, but to make sure I haven't passed away overnight. I push myself upright in bed, my knees and shoulders aching like they do most mornings. My room is on the first floor, once a guest room, until they remodeled it for me when I moved in 5 years ago. That's a funny way to put it. I've been in this house far longer than anyone thinks. They just don't know it. Right on cue, the knock comes again. "Frank, you're not dead." Melissa calls, her tone more irritated than concerned. "Not yet," I answer the same way I always do. "Breakfast is in 20 minutes. Don't be late," she says, walking off before I can reply. Melissa is my youngest, 43 now, and she's been difficult since the day she could talk. Her mother, my late wife, Margaret, passed when Melissa was 15. Maybe that's why she's so frosty. She's always seemed to resent me for surviving when her mother didn't. Or maybe that's just who she is. I stopped trying to figure it out years ago. I pull on a clean, long-sleeved shirt. It's always chilly in this house. Melissa keeps the thermostat low to save on heating costs, even though Daniel does well enough as a senior accountant. They both obsess over pinching pennies. Every purchase is second-guessed, every extra dime hoarded. Sometimes I wonder if they'd even know what real financial struggle feels like. In the mirror, I see a wiry old man with thinning silver hair and deep lines etched around his eyes. My hands, scarred and rough from decades of minor burns, are a dead giveaway to my years working with electricity. For 45 years, I was an electrical engineer at the city's utility plant. Honest work, steady pay, a modest pension. At least that's the official story. The truth I've carried for 2 decades feels heavier than all the cables I ever laid. In 2004, I won $1.9 million in the state lottery. I told no one. Not Margaret, she was already sick, and certainly not the kids. I've got 2 of them, Melissa and my oldest, Evan. Both grew up spoiled, both constantly asking for handouts. Every time Margaret and I helped, they came back wanting more. If they'd known about the winnings, they'd have blown through it in a few years and blamed me for not having more. So I stayed quiet, tucked the money into a high-interest account, and a year after Margaret passed, I bought this house in Cedar Falls for $650,000. 3-story, spacious, great neighborhood. But I told the kids I'd found a good rental. "Frank, you're late," Melissa yells from downstairs. I shuffle toward the kitchen. Daniel is already at the table, eyes glued to his laptop. He gives me a small nod. Our relationship is polite but cold. To him, I'm just the father-in-law, an old man he has to put up with. "Good morning," I say, taking my usual seat. Melissa sets down a bowl of oatmeal, same as every day, made with water, no butter, half a banana on the side. "For your health," she always says, though we both know it's really about saving money. "You haven't forgotten Evan, and the kids are coming over today, have you?" she asks, pouring coffee. "I hope you won't hide in your room all day like last time." "I'm not hiding from my own son," I reply, poking at the bland oatmeal. "Then why barely speak to him at Christmas?" she challenges, arms folded. "He thinks you don't care." I glance up. "When's the last time he called me just to talk, not to ask for money?" Daniel chuckles under his breath without looking up. Melissa shoots him a glare. "He's busy. He runs his own trucking company, has 2 kids. Funny how he always finds time to call when he needs cash for a new rig or warehouse expansion," I say. Melissa's jaw tightens. "That's not fair. We all care about you. Who took you in when you couldn't live alone anymore? Who makes your meals, does your laundry, drives you to the doctor?" I want to remind her that I live in my own house, but I just nod, like I always do. I'm grateful for the roof over my head. "Exactly," she says, satisfied, ending the conversation. Just then, my granddaughter Sophie walks in. 19, a freshman at the local community college, she's the only one in this place who talks to me for reasons other than duty. "Morning, everyone," she says, kissing my cheek. "How'd you sleep, Grandpa?" The usual sweetheart, half the night counting sheep, the other half counting my aching feet. Sophie laughs while Melissa rolls her eyes. She's never understood my humor. "You heading to class today?" I ask. "Yeah, till 3. Then I've got a shift at the coffee shop till 8. She pours coffee, grabs an apple. "I can swing by tomorrow if you want to take a walk in the park." "Sophie, Grandpa's got other things to deal with," Melissa cuts in. "The plumber's coming tomorrow to check his bathroom." That leak just keeps coming back. "I can do both," I say. "Plumbers usually show up in the morning." We don't know exactly when Melissa insists. "You'd better be home all day." I don't argue, never worth it. Melissa always has a reason I shouldn't go anywhere. Part of me thinks she's afraid I'll keel over in public and she'll have to handle the mess. Sophie throws her mom a look, but says nothing. She's learned when to let things slide. "Okay, I gotta go," she says, draining her coffee. "See you tonight." She kisses my cheek again before darting out. The front door slams, and somehow the house feels colder. Daniel pushes back from the table, collecting his laptop and papers. "Don't forget to check the electric bill," he tells Melissa. It was way higher than usual last month. He glances at me, and I know exactly what he's thinking. That the old man sits here all day running up the utilities. "I barely turn the lights on," I tell him. "And I only watch TV in the evenings." "No one's blaming you," Frank Daniel says with a fake smile. "It's just that the bills keep climbing and your pension isn't exactly stretchable, is it?" I nod, thinking of my bank account holding over $1 million money no one knows about. Sometimes I ask myself why I keep that secret. Then I remember the gleam in Melissa's eyes whenever money comes up, calculated hungry. Or Evan's phone calls always opening with, "How's your health, Dad?" and ending with a request for a few thousand. When Daniel leaves, Melissa starts clearing the table. "Don't forget rent's due Monday," she says without looking at me. I remember. Every month I transfer $2,000 into Melissa's account. She calls it rent for the landlord. Truth is, I own this place. I'm just shuffling money between my own accounts. "And don't forget utilities," she adds. "Your share this month's $350. I nod again. My share seems to creep up every month, though I barely use water or electricity. But to Melissa, it's fair I'm living in their home, enjoying their amenities. After breakfast, I retreat to my room. It's small but comfortable bed desk chair by the window, a shelf lined with well-worn mystery novels I cycle through again and again. On the table sits an old radio receiver I restored myself. Tinkering with busted electronics is one of the few joys I still have. I settle into the chair and watch the backyard. Spring in Cedar Falls is always beautiful magnolias blooming fresh green leaves, birds returning from the south. Margaret loved this time of year. We used to sit on the back porch of our old house, sipping tea and just watching the world. Sometimes I wonder if she'd approve of all my secrecy. Margaret was direct to a fault, never one for half-truths. Frank Walker, she'd say, "You've turned into a sly old fox." But I also remember her tears when Evan or Melissa came around asking for money without a word about her health. "We raised them wrong," she told me once, and I thought maybe she'd understand. The sound of a car pulling up breaks my thoughts. A black SUV, Evan's. My son steps out, followed by his wife, Claire, and their 2 teenagers, Tyler and Megan. They don't visit often, even though they live just 20 minutes away. Evan's 50 now, but looks older, soft around the middle, hair thinning, always on edge. His trucking business has been barely hanging on for years, yet he still splurges on new cars and private school tuition. I leave my room as Melissa opens the door, throwing her arms around her brother. "Evan." "I'm so glad you're here," she says in a higher than usual voice. Kids, you've grown so much. The teens mutter greetings without lifting their eyes from their phones. Claire hugs Melissa, and they swap compliments. Then Evan notices me. "Hey, Dad." He gives me a stiff hug. "How's your health? Still breathing?" I answer with a smile. "Good to see you, son." We move into the living room. The teens collapse onto the couch, faces buried in their screens. Claire and Melissa disappear into the kitchen, chatting about some new diet trend, leaving Evan and me alone. "How's business?" I ask, though I already know. "Rough," he admits. "Too much competition, customers wanting more for less." "You know, Dad," he lowers his voice, "I was wondering if you might have some spare cash. I need to update my trucks, or we'll lose the Blue Ridge contract." And there it is, 5 minutes in. "Evan, you know my situation. I'm living on my pension covering rent and utilities here." I know, he says quickly. "But maybe you've got a little set aside for a rainy day. I'd pay it back with interest once things pick up." I study him, the same look he had at 12, begging for a new bike because his old one wasn't cool enough. Same tone, same expression. "No, Evan, I don't have savings." His face hardens. "I see. Just asking." The rest of the visit is strained. Evan barely speaks to me, and the kids act like I'm invisible. After lunch, they pack up fast, saying they've got urgent errands. As the door shuts, Melissa turns to me. "What did you say to him?" He looked upset. "The truth that I didn't have money to fund his business." Melissa shakes her head. "Do you have to be so cold? He's your son. He's trying to keep his business alive, and I'm just trying to stretch my pension to the end of the month," I counter. "Which, by the way, I'm already sharing with you." Melissa presses her lips into a thin line. "You live in my house. You eat my food. You use my electricity. It'd be strange if you didn't pay, wouldn't it? My house," I think, bitterly marveling at how easily she's claimed ownership of something I bought outright with my own money, and how confidently she talks about me owing her for the right to stay here. "Of course," I say aloud. "All's fair." That evening, when the house has settled into quiet, I sit in my room with the radio turned low, letting old jazz drift through the air so it won't carry into Melissa and Daniel's room. Through the wall, I can hear them murmuring about my stubborn streak and lack of gratitude. How I refuse to help my own son when I must be sitting on some hidden stash. I catch my reflection in the darkened window, a worn old man with a faint, bitter smile. 20 years I've kept this secret. 20 years I've lived in two worlds at once. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier to just tell them, but then I picture the hunger in Evan's eyes, Melissa's calculating tone, and I know. No, I did the right thing. The money wouldn't have changed them. It would have vanished faster than a summer storm. It's moments like these I miss Margaret most. She was my compass, my conscience. What would she say now? Would she stand by me or call me out? Around 9, I hear a soft knock on my door. "Grandpa, you awake? Come in, sweetheart," I answer. Sophie slips inside, exhausted from her long day, but still smiling. "How was your day?" she asks, perching on the edge of my bed. "Your uncle stopped by," I tell her. "Wanted money for trucks." Sophie rolls her eyes. "Figures. He never visits without a reason, does he?" I shrug. "He's got his own troubles." "That's no excuse to use you," she says firmly. "Mom's the same way. They both act like you owe them something." I'm struck again by how sharp Sophie is, 19, and already seeing through things her elders refuse to. "Your mom takes care of me," I say, though we both know that's not the whole truth. "She cares about the money you give her," Sophie mutters. Then she softens. "Sorry, I don't mean to badmouth her, but she could treat you better." I smile and take her hand. "You remind me of your grandmother." She told the truth, even when it stung. Sophie smiles sadly. "I wish I remembered her. I was only 4 when she passed." "She'd have been proud of you," I tell her. You're the only one in this family who isn't obsessed with money. Probably because I've never had much. She laughs. It's hard to get hooked on something you've never had. I agree. We talk a little more about her classes, her coffee shop job, the book she's reading. She yawns and stands. Time for bed. I've got an early shift. She leans down and kisses my cheek. Good night, Grandpa. Don't let them get to you. After she's gone, I sit in my chair for a long while, staring out into the dark. It's times like this I think maybe I should tell Sophie the truth that one day her broke grandfather will leave her a small fortune, but then she'd have to hide it from her own parents, and that's not fair. Better to wait. A few more years she'll be done with school standing on her own 2 feet. Then maybe I'll tell her. Until then, I'll keep playing the part the old man scraping by on a pension, dependent on his daughter's generosity. I'll keep paying rent on my own house and pretending not to notice the side eyes when I turn on a light during the day. It's a strange life full of little deceptions. But it's my choice, my shield. And as long as I can sit here in the quiet, letting the saxophone drift out of the radio, while I remember Margaret, I can live with it. Sunday morning greets me with a dull headache. I wake to the sound of a lawnmower humming right outside my window. The neighbor across the street is out there, again trimming the grass. The neighbor across the street fires up his mower at exactly 800 a.m. every Sunday, no matter the season. I forced myself upright in bed and reached for the pill bottle I keep on my nightstand. At my age, the morning routine is less about coffee first and more about making sure the right pills are in the right hand. Through the wall, I could hear Melissa and Daniel in the kitchen. Their voices were muffled, but words like bills and problems came through clearly. Talking about money again. Melissa's fixation on cutting costs would be impressive if it weren't so exhausting, especially since she and Daniel do just fine financially. Some days I think it's the only topic that truly excites them. I got dressed slowly and stepped into the hallway. The kitchen chatter stopped for half a second when I appeared in the doorway. Morning, I said, heading straight for the coffee pot. Melissa sat at the table with a calculator in one hand and a pile of bills, receipts, and bank statements spread out in front of her. Daniel was leaning against the window frame, arms crossed. Frank, we were just talking about you, Daniel said in that clipped businesslike voice he uses when he thinks he's in charge. You remember your rent's due tomorrow, right? I poured myself coffee, keeping my tone neutral. Didn't forget. I'll send it over today. Good, Daniel went on. Also, the electric rate went up again. Your share this month is $400. I nearly choked on the first sip. 400? Last month it was $350. Inflation, Frank Daniel replied like he was explaining algebra to a kid. Everything's more expensive now. Plus, he added, you've been home more TV on lights on. I hardly ever watch TV, I said. And I turn lights on when it's dark. That's it. The meter doesn't lie. Melissa cut in without looking up from her paperwork. If you think it's too much, we can put a separate meter on your room. There was no point arguing. If they wanted to squeeze more out of me, they'd find a way, truth optional. I'd suspected for years they were padding my share of the utilities, but there's no way to prove it. All right, I said finally. 400 it is. Melissa gave a little satisfied nod like she'd just closed a deal. Daniel clapped me on the shoulder with mock sympathy. We've all got to tighten the belt, man. Times are tough. I nodded, thinking about the 7 figures sitting quietly in my account. Tough times. If only they knew. After breakfast, I stepped outside for some air. The day was warm, neighbors out trimming hedges, washing cars, tending flower beds. Ordinary scenes from ordinary lives. I wondered if they had tangled, exhausting relationships with their kids too, or if I'd just gotten especially lucky. I strolled slowly along the sidewalk, the sun warming my face. This neighborhood is full of big, well-kept houses, all with pristine lawns and manicured shrubs, middle-class folks trying their best to look upper class. My place is one of the largest on the street, 3 stories, a wide front porch, and a backyard that slopes down to a small pond. Beautiful house. Shame it doesn't hold much happiness. Mr. Walker morning, I turned to see our next-door neighbor, Harper Dwight, a friendly man in his early 50s who works in insurance. We exchange pleasantries from time to time. "Morning, Harper," I said. "Perfect day, isn't it, gorgeous?" He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Have you heard the Browns are selling? Asking nearly $1 million. "Really?" I replied, not especially invested in neighborhood gossip, but polite enough to keep the conversation going. "Yep," Harper said, clearly relishing the scoop. "They've had several showings already. The agent says interest is high. Prices around here are shooting up." I nodded, thinking about my own place. If the Browns can list their smaller home for nearly $1 million, mine would be worth even more. I bought it 20 years ago for $650,000. Cedar Falls real estate has boomed since then. "Ever think about selling?" Harper asked suddenly. "It's a lot of house for just 3 people. Must be a chore to keep it up." I smiled. "Not mine, Harper. I just rent a room from my daughter." It's a lie I've told for so long, I almost believe it myself. "Ah, that's right," Harper said. "My mistake. Well, if she ever decides to sell, I know a great realtor, my brother-in-law. He handles high-end properties. I'll pass it along," I said, lying again, and wished him a good day before continuing my walk. Selling had never seriously crossed my mind before. Why sell the place I'd called home for so many years? But after my chat with Harper, the thought had taken root. What if I did sell it? What would Melissa do when the actual owner decided to put the property on the market? The image of her face in that moment made me chuckle. But the amusement faded quickly. Why not? Why not sell the house and finally live on my own terms? No more constant lectures, no more paying for the privilege of staying in my own home. No more daily humiliation, Margaret might have called it petty revenge. She'd always tried to rise above that sort of thing. "Frank," she would have said, "you're starting to sound just like them." But maybe this time she'd understand. Maybe after seeing how Melissa treated me, she'd approve. I thought back to when I first met Margaret in 1968 at a Friday night dance at the local community hall. I was 20, she was 19. The tallest, prettiest girl in the room, with chestnut hair and a laugh that made people turn their heads. We married the following year, bought a small house just outside Cedar Falls. I worked as an electrician. She taught elementary school. Life was good, even if we didn't have much. Then came the kids first, Evan, then Melissa, and everything shifted. They never seemed satisfied. Evan wanted the newest, most expensive toys. Melissa had to have designer clothes. Margaret and I took extra shifts to give them more than we ever had, but it was never enough. When Margaret got sick, they didn't even bother visiting her in the hospital regularly. They were too busy. I sighed and let my thoughts return to the present. My walk had taken me to a small park at the end of the street. I sat on a bench watching ducks glide across the pond. What would Margaret say if she saw my life now? Would she approve of my lies? Probably not. She always believed in facing the truth head on. "Tell them, Frank," she would have said. "Stop hiding." But it was far too late. 2 decades of secrets and half-truths had piled up. If I told them now, they wouldn't forgive me. Not that I cared much about their forgiveness, but the thought of another full-blown family war wasn't appealing. When I got home for dinner, Melissa was in a foul mood. She was in the kitchen slamming cabinet doors. "What's wrong?" I asked. "The boiler's busted," she snapped. Again. 3rd time this year. This place is a money pit. I sat at the table watching her bang around. Maybe we should call a different repair guy. The last one didn't seem too sharp. Melissa spun toward me, sarcasm dripping from her voice. "Oh, so you're a boiler expert now? Or do you just have cash lying around for another handyman?" I said nothing. Anything I said would just set her off further. Exactly, she went on. You sit here critiquing, but who pays me and Daniel as always? Do you have any idea what it costs to run this house? Repairs, insurance, taxes? Yes, I knew. I'd been paying for all of it for 20 years. But instead of saying that, I simply replied, I understand it's expensive. You don't understand anything. Melissa sat down across from me, arms crossed. You live here with every convenience, and all we ask is that you pay your share on time. But even that's an issue. I always pay on time, I said, feeling the heat rise in my chest. That's not enough. She shot back, her voice climbing. Costs are going up, Frank. We can't keep subsidizing you. Subsidizing? My voice rose to match hers. I pay $2,000 for one room and $400 for utilities. That's more than my pension. Where do you think the extra comes from? Melissa's tone was almost a shout now. You think money just falls from the sky? No, it's me and Daniel working our tails off to keep this place running. I took a breath, trying to rein myself in. I can increase my share if needed, I said at last, or I can look for somewhere else to live. Melissa gave a sharp, humorless laugh. And where exactly would you go? Who's going to rent to a 77-year-old on a fixed income? You think we took you in for the money? We did it because you're family. But that doesn't mean you get to be a burden. Took you in. The phrase hit like a punch. Every time she used it, I felt like a stray mutt they'd rescued out of pity. That's when Daniel walked in from his evening run, wiping sweat from his brow. He immediately sensed the tension. What's going on? The boiler's broken, Melissa said quickly. And Frank thinks we should throw more money at overpriced repair guys. I didn't say that I countered. I just suggested maybe someone else could take a look. Doesn't matter what you suggested, Daniel cut in. The point is, this house keeps getting more expensive to run, and your contribution stays the same. That's not fair to us. I already told Melissa I'm willing to increase my share, I said, feeling cornered all over again. By how much? Daniel asked in that clipped, businesslike way of his. Another $500 a month would cover the increase in expenses. I swallowed hard. Another $500. On my pension, that would be nearly impossible. Sure, I had more than enough in the bank, but they didn't know that, and I intended to keep it that way. Yeah. I'll have to think about it, I said finally. This isn't something to sit on. Daniel cut me off. Bills won't wait. He left the kitchen, and I was alone with Melissa. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. Part disappointment, part irritation, maybe even a sliver of pity. You know we're not going to throw you out on the street, she said more softly. But you've got to pay your fair share. This is adult life, Dad. Nothing's free. Adult life. I'm 77 years old. I've worked every day of my life, buried my wife, raised 2 kids, and my own daughter is lecturing me about adult life. I know, I replied, forcing my voice to stay even. I'll think about your offer. The next morning, during my usual walk, I saw a man in a sharp suit outside the Browns' house hammering a for sale sign into the front lawn. Without really thinking, I wandered over. Morning, I said. Selling the Browns' place? He turned, flashing a polished smile. That's right. Raymond Prescott, Cedar Falls Luxury Real Estate. He handed me a glossy business card. Are you looking to buy? I chuckled. No, just curious. I live in the neighborhood. I pointed toward my house down the street. Raymond let out a low whistle. That's a beauty. One of the best on this block. If you ever decide to sell, come to me. You'd get a fantastic price right now. Really? I acted surprised. How much do you think? He squinted toward my house, sizing it up. Hard to say without walking through, but with the lot size, location, and market right now. I'd guess at least $850. Could even push $900 if the inside's in good shape. I gave an exaggerated whistle. Wow. So this is a good time to sell the best in years, he said confidently. Inventory's low, demands through the roof. Houses like yours are getting multiple offers, often over asking within days. I waved the thought off. Oh no, it's not mine. I just stay there with my daughter. She owns it. I see. Raymond nodded. Well, if she ever wants to sell, give her my card. I can do a free appraisal. I slid the card into my pocket. I'll let her know. The rest of the day I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. 850, maybe even 900, far more than I'd paid 20 years ago. That kind of money would set me up for the rest of my life, free from Melissa and Daniel's scrutiny over every dollar I spent. That night, once the house was dark and quiet, I took out Raymond's card and stared at it for a long time. Then I saved his number in my phone, just in case I told myself. It's always good to have options. The next few days were calm. Melissa was busy with work. Daniel was away on business, and Sophie spent most of her time at college or at the coffee shop. I savored the rare solitude reading, fixing up my old radio and letting soft jazz fill the room. But Thursday night, the calm broke. Melissa came home from work in a mood I could see from a mile away. I was in the kitchen with a mug of tea and the newspaper when she came in and dropped her purse on the table. "Did you send the rent?" she asked without even saying hello. "Yes." "Monday," I answered, eyes still on the paper. "And the extra," I looked up. "What extra?" "The increase we talked about, another $500 a month." She crossed her arms. "You said you'd think about it." "I did think about it," I said evenly. "And I decided I can't afford it. My pension doesn't stretch that far." Her face flushed. "So you expect us to just keep covering your costs?" "That's not fair, Dad. I'm paying a fair price for a room," I shot back, my blood pressure spiking. $2,000 a month for a small bedroom is above market value. "It's not just the room," Melissa raised her voice. "You're using the kitchen, the living room, the yard. You use the electricity, the water, the gas. I pay separately for the utilities I cut in. And those bills keep climbing, even though I use almost nothing." "You use more than you think," Melissa shot back. "And even if you didn't, property costs keep rising. Taxes go up. Insurance goes up. Somebody has to cover it." I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice level. "I know it's expensive to run a house, but I can't pay more than I'm paying now. If you need extra cash, maybe you should ask Evan." Melissa gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "Are you kidding? He's drowning in his own problems. And unlike you, he's got real expenses. Kids, a business, a mortgage. I have expenses too," I said quietly. "Medications, doctors, which are mostly covered by Medicare," she snapped, cutting me off. "Don't play poor Dad. We both know you should have savings. You've worked your whole life and lived modestly. Where'd all the money go?" I stayed quiet, weighing whether to tell her the truth. That I had over $1 million sitting in the bank, or to keep the lie I'd lived for 20 years. "I spent most of it on your mother's treatment," I said finally. It wasn't entirely false. Margaret's care had been costly, but it hadn't drained my accounts. The rest went to day-to-day living. Getting old and sick isn't cheap, Melissa. She looked at me like she could see straight through it. "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "You're hiding something. You always have. But you know what? That's not my problem anymore." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over me. "Here's the deal, Dad. Either you bump your share up by $500 a month, or you start looking for someplace else. I'm not going to keep subsidizing your life at my family's expense." I looked at my youngest child, the one I used to carry in my arms, read bedtime stories to buy ice cream for on Sunday afternoons. Now she stood in front of me like a stranger. Eyes cold, voice hard. "Are you kicking me out?" I asked quietly. "I'm setting fair terms," she replied. This is business, Dad. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. My daughter telling me that evicting her own father was nothing personal. I get it, I said, rising from the table. Give me a week to decide. There's nothing to decide, Melissa said, cutting me off. Pay the rent or get out. Her words hung in the air like a blade. I walked out of the kitchen without another word back to my room. I shut the door, pulled out Raymond Prescott's business card and stared at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and dialed. Mr. Prescott, it's Frank Walker. We spoke the other day outside the Browns' place. Yes, that's right. I'd like to discuss the possibility of selling my house. I didn't wait the week I'd promised myself. The morning after that blow-up with Melissa, I started packing. It didn't take long. Some clothes, a handful of books, my old radio photographs of Margaret, a folder of important papers. A lifetime boiled down to 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. Melissa was at work when I zipped the last bag. Sophie walked in, froze in the doorway at the sight of my luggage. Grandpa? What's going on? Her voice wavered. I'm moving out, sweetheart, I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could. Your mom gave me an ultimatum. Either I pay more rent or I leave. I can't afford to pay more, so here we are. She came and sat beside me on the bed. This isn't right. She can't do this to you. You're her father. I squeezed her hand. In some families, it doesn't matter, honey. Money outweighs blood. Where will you go? Her eyes glistened. I've got a small apartment downtown. Modest, but it's enough for just me. Don't worry, I won't be on the street. Truth was, I'd lined up the apartment a week earlier, almost as if I knew where things were heading. It was a little unit in an old building near the center of Cedar Falls, clean furnished and only $1 and $200 a month. Far less than what I'd been paying for a single room in my own house. I'll come visit you, Sophie promised, hugging me tight. I'll be waiting, I said with a smile. But don't tell your mom where it is. Let her believe I disappeared from her life just like she wanted. Sophie nodded, though I could tell she hated being stuck between us. 19 is too young to be torn between loyalty and love. The cab arrived at noon. I stood for a moment, taking in the small room I'd called mine for the last 5 years, playing the role of a broke old man dependent on his daughter's generosity. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was walking away from my own home, pushed out by someone who had no idea she'd been living under my roof all along. Sophie helped carry my bags to the curb, then wrapped me in one last hug. Goodbye, Grandpa. I'll call you tomorrow, she said. I'll be waiting, I replied, climbing into the cab. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the house. Big, beautiful, and bought outright, with money that had fallen into my lap like manna from heaven 20 years earlier. A house that before long wouldn't be mine anymore. The apartment was exactly what I'd pictured typical digs for a single retiree living on a tight budget. One small bedroom, a tiny living space that doubled as a kitchen, and a bathroom so cramped you could wash your hands and brush your teeth without moving your feet. Everything was old, but it was clean and in good working order. I unpacked slowly, setting Margaret's framed photo on the bedside table, then lowered myself into the worn armchair by the window. A strange wave came over me. Part sadness, part relief, part pure resolve. Sadness over how things had crumbled between my daughter and me. Relief that I no longer had to fake gratitude while swallowing daily humiliation. And resolve, because now I was ready to see my plan through. The next day, I met with Raymond Prescott at a small cafe just a few blocks from my new place. He'd sounded surprised when I called, and even more so when I revealed that I, not my daughter, was the legal owner of the house. But his professional cool came back in an instant. Mr. Walker, he said, shaking my hand. Glad you decided to let me handle this. Your property is a real standout in the Cedar Falls market. I nodded and took a sip of coffee. I want to sell it quickly and quietly, I told him. There's one delicate complication: my daughter and her family who live there don't know I own it. Raymond raised an eyebrow but kept his questions to himself. I understand. Family situations can be tricky, but that won't be a problem. We can keep the transaction confidential. The only thing is the buyers will need access to the house for viewings. I know, I said. You can tell my daughter the current owner has decided to sell, and she'll have the standard move-out period once the sale closes. She doesn't need to know I'm the owner. Raymond tapped his fingers against the table. It's possible. We could process the sale through a trust or an LLC to keep your name out of public record. But let me ask you, are you absolutely sure you want to go that route? Family secrets have a way of coming to light at the worst possible time. I chuckled. This secret's been kept for 20 years. A few more months won't hurt. Fair enough, he said with a nod. Now about the price. After a preliminary appraisal and market check, I believe we could list at $890,000. It's aggressive, but the demand right now could support it. That works for me, I replied, but I want to set a floor of $840,000. If an offer meets or beats that, I'll sign immediately. Raymond smiled. You've clearly done your homework. $840K is a smart benchmark. I'm confident we'll get higher, but this gives us a solid target. We went over the details: commission, showing, schedule, marketing approach. Raymond was all business, explaining each step without fluff. By the time we wrapped up, I felt certain I'd picked the right man for the job. I'll have the paperwork ready by week's end, he said as we stood to leave. In the meantime, I'll arrange for professional photos and a virtual tour. When would it be a good time for me to walk through the house? Raymond asked. My daughter works weekdays from 9 to 5, I told him. That's the best window. I'll give you a key. He nodded and we shook hands before parting ways. I headed back to my little apartment with an odd sense of relief. The wheel had finally started to turn. Soon, my plan for payback would be in motion. That evening, Melissa's name lit up my phone screen. I just sat there for a few seconds staring at it. A part of me wanted to ignore her calls forever. But I knew that would only drag things out, and truthfully, I was curious what she'd say. Hello, I answered at last. Dad, where are you? Her voice carried irritation, but I could also hear a flicker of something else, concern maybe. Somewhere safe, I said vaguely. You just up and left without even saying goodbye. Didn't I? I came home and you were gone. Your stuff was gone. Sophie said you took a cab and left. What did you expect, Melissa? You gave me an ultimatum. That's basically kicking me out. I didn't kick you out, she said quickly. I just said you should pay your fair share, which I couldn't afford. I cut in. That's eviction by another name. There was a pause. Then she sighed. Maybe I was too harsh. We can talk. You shouldn't be living alone at your age. It's not safe. Ah, there it was. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the rent money. Without my contribution, the family budget had taken a hit. I'm just fine on my own, I said. Found a small apartment I can afford. Nothing for you to worry about. But your things, she began. I took what I needed, I interrupted. The rest you can toss or keep. Your choice. You're being unreasonable, she said, slipping back into that patronizing tone I knew so well. You're 77 years old. You can't just go off and live alone. Clearly I can, I replied. And I am. Don't worry, Melissa. I won't be a burden to you or Daniel. That's not the point, she snapped. We're family. We need to stick together. Family. How convenient she remembered that word now after cutting me loose. I'm sorry, Melissa, but you broke that idea yourself when you gave me the ultimatum, I said evenly. I respect your choice. Now I've made mine. This is what's best for everyone. She kept trying to persuade me, but I didn't budge. Finally, she gave up. Fine. Do whatever you want. But when living alone gets too hard, don't come running to me. Don't worry, I said, and hung up. The next few days were spent settling into my new place, stocking up on groceries, finding the nearest pharmacy, learning the bus routes. Without the daily arguments, without having to justify every expense, without the constant reminder that I was an inconvenience, I could finally breathe. Even in modest surroundings, I felt freer than I had in years. True to her word, Sophie called on the second day. I gave her my address, and that evening she showed up with a container of homemade cookies and a new book. "How's it going?" she asked, glancing around. "Comfortable," I said, pouring tea. "It's quiet. Neighbors are mostly folks my age. There's even a little park nearby. I walk there every morning." She sat at the small kitchen table, resting her chin in her hands. "Mom's furious," she said. "At first she thought you were bluffing and would come back. Now she knows you're serious, and it's driving her crazy." I smiled. I can picture it. "How's Daniel taking it? He's stressing about money," Sophie said with a roll of her eyes. "Still crunching numbers to see how they'll cover the house without your rent. They're both acting like you betrayed them, not the other way around." I just shook my head. I wasn't going to make Sophie feel any more caught in the middle. "What about Evan? Does he know I moved out?" "Yeah, Mom called him," she said, taking a sip of tea. His response was, "Typical Frank, always thinking of himself." "Sorry, Grandpa, but my uncle's a jerk." I laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like years. "Don't apologize, sweetheart. Every family's got its challenges, as they say." We talked for almost 2 hours. Sophie told me about her classes, her part-time job at the coffee shop, and her big dreams for the future. She wanted to become a journalist, writing about the real issues people face every day. She had ambition, a sharp mind, and more determination than most people twice her age. I hoped that one day, the money she inherited from me would help her make those dreams a reality. When she left, the quiet settled in again. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I'd felt before. It was a peaceful stillness, the kind that comes when you finally have room to breathe. 3 days later, my phone rang. Mr. Walker Raymond's voice came through upbeat. "We've already got interested buyers." "That fast?" I asked, surprised. "I took photos and a virtual tour yesterday, posted the listing this morning. And we've already had 5 requests for showings. I told you this market is on fire right now. And your property? It's a showpiece. 3 stories, pristine condition, in one of the best neighborhoods in Cedar Falls. Places like this don't come along often." We agreed that he'd bring potential buyers through when Melissa was at work. I handed over a second set of keys and gave him one clear instruction. "Leave no trace you've been there. Lock everything exactly the way it was." "Don't worry, Mr. Walker," he assured me. "I'm a professional. Your daughter won't suspect a thing until the very last moment." The next day, Melissa called. Her tone was softer than usual, almost apologetic. "Dad, I've been thinking about our situation," she began. "Maybe we can work out a compromise. You could pay a little more, not the full $500, but maybe $250. "That's interesting," I replied evenly. "What's changed?" "Nothing's changed," she said quickly. "You're my father. I just don't want you living alone in some cheap apartment. It's not safe." I had to stop myself from laughing. Melissa had never been a convincing liar. It was obvious she'd started to feel the strain of losing my rent money. "Thanks for your concern," I said, "but I'm already settled in. Signed a 6-month lease, put down a deposit. It's quiet here. No one telling me how much electricity I'm allowed to use or when to turn the heat on." "Dad, be reasonable," she said, a little irritation creeping into her voice. "You can't live alone. What if you fall or get sick at night?" "I've got a phone for emergencies," I replied. "And I'm not nearly as helpless as you seem to think." She sighed. "You've always been stubborn. Even Mom used to say you were impossible to argue with. The mention of Margaret caught me off guard. Melissa rarely brought up her mother, almost like she'd erased her from memory. Your mother knew when to push and when to back off, I said quietly. It's a shame you didn't inherit that. The conversation ended not long after. Melissa muttered something about calling later, then hung up. I knew she wouldn't stop trying to get me back, not because she missed me, but because of the financial hit she'd taken. The week went by quickly. Raymond called daily with updates showing buyer feedback interest levels. The response was overwhelming. 12 families toured the house in the first 3 days, and half were seriously considering it. On the 7th day, Raymond called again, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. Mr. Walker, we have an offer. $860,000 cash with a quick close. Retired couple from New York fell in love with the place, especially the pond view. My heart picked up. $860,000 more than I'd dared hope for. After the commission and taxes, I'd clear about $750,000. Combined with what I already had in savings, it was more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I accept, I said without hesitation. Excellent, Raymond replied. I'll get the paperwork ready and coordinate with their agent. If everything goes smoothly, we can close in 2 weeks. What about my daughter? I asked. When does she find out it's standard for the new owners to give tenants 30 days to move after closing? Raymond said. But in this case, since the buyers want to move quickly, we can tell your daughter as soon as the preliminary contract is signed, Raymond said. That'll give her more time to find another place. Do that, I agreed. The sooner she knows, the better. After the call, I sat by the window watching the street and weighing my decision. Part of me felt bitter. This wasn't how I'd imagined my last years, surrounded by family, grandkids, dropping by on weekends, a daughter who cared out of love instead of obligation. Instead, I was selling my house to spite someone who saw me as a paycheck. But another part of me felt a grim satisfaction. Melissa would finally know the truth, that she'd been living in my home all along, not the other way around. That I wasn't some frail old man reliant on her goodwill. I could have pulled the rug out any time, and now I was doing it. Margaret probably wouldn't have approved. She used to say anger poisons the one who carries it, not the one it's aimed at. But she never saw what Melissa became after she died. She didn't hear the cold remarks or endure the constant little humiliations. I glanced at Margaret's photo on the nightstand. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I murmured. Even the most patient man breaks eventually. The next few days blurred into paperwork, signing forms, answering questions, handing over bank records. Raymond handled everything smoothly, explaining each step. Melissa called a few times, still pushing me to move back. I kept my answers vague, giving her no reason for hope and no clue about my plans. Let her hear the news from the realtor like any other tenant. On the 10th day after I'd moved out, Raymond called again. Mr. Walker, the preliminary contract signed. Buyers put down an $86,000 deposit. We can officially notify your daughter now. How? I asked. Normally we send a certified letter with a 30-day vacate notice. But in your case, a face-to-face meeting might be more effective. I can stop by tomorrow. She'll be furious, I warned. Don't worry, he grinned. 15 years in this business, I've seen worse. I told him not to reveal my role until the very end. He promised, but reminded me that my name would appear in the closing documents. If she looks closely, she'll see you're the seller. I understand, I said. By then it won't matter. What matters is that she doesn't know now. That night I lay awake imagining Raymond breaking the news. Melissa's face when she realized she couldn't stay. Her calling Daniel in a panic. The thought brought me both satisfaction and an odd emptiness. Was this really what I wanted, to punish my own daughter, even if she earned it? I stepped to the window. Night had settled over Cedar Falls, the streetlights glowing while life went on, indifferent to the dramas behind closed doors. Somewhere in that big house, Melissa slept unaware tomorrow would change everything. You're doing the right thing, I told myself. She chose this path when she put money above family. But somewhere deep inside, Margaret's voice whispered, "Are there winners in family wars, Frank? Or only losers?" I didn't know the answer. I only knew Melissa's call would come soon. Raymond was meeting her this morning. I sat in my little apartment trying to read a mystery novel, but the words swam before my eyes. I couldn't stop wondering what was happening in my old house. How was Melissa taking the news? Would she blow up, break down, or try to coldly strategize like Daniel? The call came at exactly 11:30. Her name lit up my screen. I drew in a slow breath and answered. "Hello? What the hell is going on?" Melissa's voice was sharp, no greeting, straight to the point. "What are you talking about?" I asked, making no effort to ease her panic. "A realtor was just here," she nearly shouted. "He says the house is sold and we have to move out 30 days after closing. This has to be a mistake, maybe some mix-up with the rent." This was it, the moment I'd been waiting on for 2 weeks. "No, Melissa. There's no mistake," I said evenly. "The house has been sold. But how you've been paying rent on time. I've seen the receipts myself. The owner can do what they want with their property," I said, "including selling it." "Then we need to contact him," she insisted. "We could even buy it ourselves. Daniel and I have great credit." "Melissa," I cut in, "you don't understand. The deal is done. It's sold for $840,000. The money's already in place. This is insane. We've lived here over 5 years. We must have some rights. Frank, you've got to help us. You dealt with the owner, right? You paid him directly." I closed my eyes. Time for the truth. "No, Melissa. I never paid a landlord. What are you talking about?" "Of course you did. You paid me. I paid him. No." I slowed my words. There was no landlord. The house was mine, always was. Silence. I could almost picture her face shifting from confusion to shock. What she finally managed. "I owned it. Bought it 20 years ago after your mother passed with lottery winnings. I was never a tenant. That story was a lie. That's impossible. You always said you were scraping by renting." "I lied," I said, "because I knew if you and Evan found out, you'd bleed me dry. College tuition, your first car, the wedding you were never satisfied, always asking for more." "So you lied to us for 20 years, she said, voice rising. "Made us think we were helping you when we were paying you to live in your own house." "That's right. And now, I've sold it." "You're throwing your own daughter out on the street," she snapped. "I sold my property," I corrected. "The same property you demanded rent for, the one you threatened to evict me from unless I paid more. Remember, pay up or get out." "Well, I got out. Now it's your turn." "You're a monster," she spat. "What's Sophie going to say when she hears her grandpa tossed us out? I'm not tossing anyone out. You have 30 days to find another place. And leave Sophie out of this. She's the only one who's ever treated me decently. She'll hate you when she learns the truth." Melissa hissed. "We all will. Evan, Daniel, everyone. You'll be alone, Frank. Completely alone." "I've already been alone," I said quietly. "Since your mother died. You and Evan only came around when you wanted money. Your threats are 20 years too late." I heard her choke back a sob. For the first time, there was real emotion, not just outrage. "It's not fair," she said unsteadily. "We took care of you. You took care of my money." I cut in. "You don't know what meds I take, what books I read, what music I love. You've never cared about me, just my wallet. That's not true. I cooked, I washed, I took you to the doctor and made me feel like a burden for every favor I added, counting how much power I used, how much water I drank. That's not care, Melissa. That's bookkeeping." I can't believe you feel this way after all we've done, she said quietly. And I can't believe you still can't see the truth, I replied. But it doesn't matter. The house is gone. You've got 30 days to move. I suggest you start looking now. You're going to regret this. Melissa warned, her voice edged with venom. I'll tell everyone, family, neighbors, exactly what you've done. Tell them I said with a shrug she couldn't see. I've got nothing to hide. I ended the call and set the phone on the table, noticing my hands tremble just slightly. On the surface, I sounded calm, but it wasn't an easy conversation. I felt a strange mixed relief. The truth was out, grief over what was left of my relationship with my daughter, and the hollow ache that follows a long-anticipated but bitter victory. I walked to the window. The day was bright, people passing on the sidewalk, going about their lives with no idea of the small family war unfolding a few blocks away. Life didn't pause for anyone's personal disasters. 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was Evan. I'd been expecting it. Of course, Melissa had run straight to her brother. I picked up. What the hell are you doing, Dad? His voice was all fury. Melissa's in tears. She says you sold the house. You're tossing your own kids out. I sold my property, I said evenly. Something I had every right to do. But why now? And why didn't you ever tell us you owned it? Because the second you knew, you'd be after your share just like always. Every time I had extra, you and Melissa had your hands out. Remember the loan for your business? Every visit, every call ended with you asking for money. That's not fair, he shot back. I asked for help because I thought you wanted me to succeed. You're my father, and I did help plenty. But it was never enough, was it? More, always more. Where was the respect, the gratitude? You didn't even call on my birthday last year. I had a meeting I couldn't cancel, he said defensively. Of course, I sighed. There's always something more important than your father, until you need money. I can't believe you think we're like that, he said, voice tight. We're your family. We took care of you. No, Evan, I corrected. You took care of my money. That's why you think this is revenge, me selling my own home. Melissa's got 30 days to find another place. With their income, they'll be fine. 30 days is nothing, he snapped. Do you even know how hard it is to find a house in Cedar Falls? Prices are insane. I know, I said. That's why I sold mine. $840,000 was a fair deal. There was a pause. $840. What are you doing with that money? His tone shifted instantly from anger to curiosity. None of your business, I said. It's my money. But it's the family home, he argued. Mom would never approve. The mention of Margaret stung, but I didn't take the bait. Don't drag your mother into this. She wouldn't have approved of how you two treated me either. She'd be ashamed of the greed you've shown. That's low, Dad, he said coldly. No lower than you using her memory to guilt me, I replied. It was going nowhere. He kept calling me a traitor. I stayed firm. Finally, he gave up. Do whatever you want, but don't come crawling back when you're sick and alone. Melissa and I are done. You both were done a long time ago, I said quietly, then hung up and sank into my chair, feeling the weight of it all. Those calls had drained me in ways I hadn't expected, not physically, but deep down. Saying out loud what I'd bottled up for decades was both freeing and painful. The next voice I heard belonged to Emily. Grandpa, what's going on? She asked, her tone tight with worry. Mom's a wreck. She says you sold the house and are throwing them out. Is that true? I sighed. Poor Emily, stuck in the middle. Partly, I said. I did sell the house, but I'm not tossing anyone out on the street. They've got 30 days to find somewhere else. But I don't get it, she said, puzzled. How could you sell it? Wasn't it Mom and Dad's no sweetheart? I said gently. It's always been mine. I bought it 20 years ago. I just never told anyone. There was a long pause while she absorbed that. You mean, all this time they were living in your house? That's right. And charging me rent, I said with a bitter chuckle. But why hide it? She asked. Because the second they knew your parents and Uncle Evan would be after their cut. I won the lottery back then, a big one. I bought the house, put the rest in the bank. If they'd known, it would have been gone in a year. So, you didn't trust them. I knew them, I corrected. And I was right. Look what happened when I refused to raise the rent. Your mother literally kicked me out of my own place. Emily was quiet for a while. Then Mom says you did it to get revenge. Was it revenge? I thought for a moment. Yes, partly. I won't lie, I imagined her shock. But more than that, I was tired. Tired of lying. Tired of justifying every dollar. I wanted my freedom to spend my own money without someone holding out their hand. I get it, she said softly. But it's still harsh, Grandpa. They don't have a home now. They've got the money to rent or buy, I countered. They're not on the street, and they've got a month to move. You're probably right, she admitted. It's just a lot to take in. I don't know how to feel. You don't have to take sides, Emily, I said. I'll love you no matter what. I know, she whispered. I'm just scared Mom won't let me see you. She's furious. That's her choice, but my door will always be open to you. When we hung up, I felt hollow. It was like every bottled-up emotion had spilled out in one day, leaving nothing but emptiness. No thrill of revenge, just exhaustion and a strange relief that I didn't have to pretend anymore. I shut off my phone. Enough for one day. Tomorrow might bring calmer heads, though I doubted it. That evening, I took a slow walk. Warm air, the scent of blooming trees. My mind replayed the day, Melissa's fury, Evan's anger, Emily's confusion, and how one decision decades ago to hide my lottery winnings had led here. Was it the right choice? Maybe if I'd told them from the start, they'd have shown me respect. Or maybe they'd have drained my savings even faster. I thought of Margaret, her sharp instincts, her belief that secrets eat away at families like termites through wood. Was she right? Or was my family already hollowed out by greed long before the truth came out? I didn't know. I doubted I ever would. But I knew one thing, I was done living a lie. Whatever came next, I'd face it with clear eyes and a clean conscience. Back in my apartment, I turned on my phone, 10 missed calls from Melissa, 5 from Evan, 2 from Emily, and a pile of unread texts. I muted it and set it on the nightstand. Tomorrow. I'd deal with it all tomorrow. Tonight I just wanted peace. I sat by the window watching the sun dip over Cedar Falls, feeling a strange light freedom, as if the weight I'd carried for 20 years had finally rolled off my shoulders. Yes, I'd hurt my children. And yes, they'd probably never forgive me. I was no longer chained to my own lies or trapped by their games. For the first time in decades, I felt like myself, not the poor old man living off his daughter's pity. Not the stingy father refusing his son a handout, just a man. Frank Walker, a 77-year-old widower with the right to manage his life and money as he saw fit. It wasn't victory. It was release. 3 weeks had passed since Melissa learned the truth about the house. In that time, my life had shifted completely. The sale closed without a hitch, and after taxes and fees, I held a check for $735,000. I deposited it alongside the lottery winnings I'd guarded all these years. The first thing I did was buy a smaller place on the south side of Cedar Falls, 1-story, 3 bedrooms, a roomy living area, and a porch that looked out over a neat little garden. It cost me $520,000, well below what I got for the old house, but it suited me perfectly. No stairs, wide doorways, and a layout designed for easy living. The realtor, an energetic woman named Helen Morrow, raised her eyebrows when I paid in full. "That's rare these days, Mr. Walker," she said as we signed the deed. "I'm too old for a mortgage," I chuckled. "I'd rather own what I have outright." Once I moved in, I began making it my own. For the first time in years, I could spend freely without hearing Melissa or Noah's opinions. I bought furniture for comfort and quality, not price tags. A big reclining armchair I dreamed of. A widescreen TV for the classic films I loved. I even replaced the threadbare shirts and pants I'd worn far too long out of fear of being called wasteful. The best investment, though, was in my health. I saw a gerontologist, Dr. Phelps, recommended by a neighbor, not the penny-pinching physician Melissa always dragged me to. He ran a full exam, adjusted my arthritis meds, and set me up with a physical therapist to help with mobility. "For someone your age, you're in fine shape, Mr. Walker," he told me. "With good care, you've got many active years ahead." Those words hit deep. For years, Melissa had painted me as frail, dependent, fading. It felt good to know she'd been wrong. While I was settling in, Melissa and Noah were scrambling to find somewhere to live. Emily told me about it during our regular calls. She was the only one still talking to me after what she called the house scandal. "They're looking at apartments," she said one night. "But Mom says nothing compares to the old place, and Dad's furious about rent prices. They're fighting constantly." "I'm sorry you have to see that," I told her. "Not your fault, Grandpa," she sighed. "Well, technically it is, but I get why you did it. I'd probably be tired of the constant demands too." That was Emily at 19. She had more perspective than her parents ever did. "How's your Uncle Evan taking it?" I asked, though I could guess. "He's mad," she said. "Calls you selfish, says you betrayed everyone. But here's the funny part. When Mom told him about your money, the first thing he did was call asking for a loan to grow his business. Right in the middle of the fight." I wasn't surprised. Evan had always been that way. Even angry, he'd look for an angle. "And your parents?" I pressed. "Mom says she'll never forgive you for lying and kicking us out. Dad's more upset about paying for a new place. For him, it's always about the money." I did. Noah's always been a numbers man, both by profession and by nature. Every choice he makes runs through a profit and loss filter. "Found anything decent?" I asked, a small twinge of guilt creeping in. "I think so," Emily said. "A new apartment complex downtown. Not as big as the house, but it's nice enough." I could picture Melissa's reaction before Emily even said it, still unhappy calling it a step down. She'd always cared more about appearances than comfort. Going from a large home to an apartment, even a modern one, was a bruise to her pride. "When are you moving into your new place?" Emily asked, steering the conversation away. "Already in," I told her. "Finished moving yesterday. You should come by, you'll like it." "I will. Just don't tell Mom." She'd never let me. "It'll be our secret," I promised. After we hung up, I sat on the porch of my new home, tea in hand, soaking in the warm evening. Strange how life had turned. I'd spent years pretending to be a broke old man, leaning on my daughter's so-called kindness. Now, with the truth out, I was free. But that freedom came at the cost of most of my family. Was it worth it? Some days I wondered if keeping the peace, playing the part, enduring the digs, might have been easier. But then I remembered the cold look in Melissa's eyes when she demanded more rent. Evan's constant requests for just a little more. The constant sense that I was tolerated only for what I could provide. No, it was worth it. Freedom meant living on my own terms, spending my own money without explanation, never fearing eviction from my own home. That was worth losing a relationship that hadn't been healthy in years. Emily kept her word and came by a few days later. Her eyes went wide as she stepped into the living room, taking in the fresh furniture and new appliances. "Wow, Grandpa," she said. "This place is amazing, way nicer than I expected." I grinned. "And what exactly did you expect, a rundown shack?" "Of course not," she laughed. "But Mom said you probably ended up in some cheap apartment on the edge of town." "She has no idea you've got all this." "She doesn't need to know," I said simply. We spent the day together. I showed her the garden, my office, with a new computer I was learning to use, and we cooked a real meal-quality ingredients, none of the bargain bin pasta and watered-down sauce I'd eaten for years. "You seem happier," Emily said later as we sat on the porch. "I am," I admitted. "First time in years, I don't have to explain myself to anyone. No excuses just for existing." "I'm glad," she said softly. "You deserve it." "So do you." I told her, taking her hand, "There's something I want to share. I've set up a trust for your education and future." Her eyes widened. "Grandpa, you didn't have to. I wanted to." I cut in. "You've cared about me, not my wallet. You deserve the chance to build your own life without worrying about money." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know what to say." "Thank you. But what about Mom and Dad?" "They don't need to know," I said with a wink. "When you graduate, it's yours to manage. Until then, it'll just grow." She hugged me tight, just like she did when she was little. "You're the best grandpa in the world," Emily said with a grin. "Even with all your secrets." I chuckled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a while. At least one bond in this family was still intact. About a month after Melissa and Noah moved into their apartment, something unexpected happened. Evan called. It was the first time I'd heard his voice since our blowout. "Dad," he said, sounding uncharacteristically gentle. "How have you been?" "I'm fine," I replied cautiously, bracing for the real reason behind the call. "And you?" "Good, good." He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what we said last time. Maybe I came on too strong. You know me, hot-headed about family stuff. I appreciate that I said evenly. Yeah, so maybe I could stop by, see your place, help with anything?" There it was. I could almost hear the gears turning. He'd learned about my new home, my money, and now wanted back in, not out of love, but opportunity. "That's kind of you," I said. "But everything's already taken care of." I could hear the letdown in his voice. "Well, maybe just a visit then. We haven't really talked in a while. Maybe another time," I said, dodging. Still busy getting things organized here. After a few failed attempts to set a date, he gave up, though I knew he'd try again, especially if Emily kept quiet about the trust I'd set up for her. Melissa held out longer. Nearly 2 months went by without a word, until one afternoon, while I was working in the garden, her car pulled up. I straightened, leaning on the rake, and watched her scan the property. "Frank," she said instead of hello. "Nice place you've got here." "Thanks," I replied evenly. "What brings you by?" "You look good," she said, almost surprised. "A decent diet, a good doctor, and no constant stress will do that," I told her. Her lips tightened, but she let it pass. "Emily said you bought this with the money from selling your old house." "That's right," I said. "Much more practical for me. 1 floor, no stairs." She glanced at the fresh paint, the garden furniture. "Must have cost a lot." "I can afford it," I answered simply. Melissa took a breath. "Look, Dad, I know things ended badly. I was upset, angry. But maybe we should try to fix this. We're still family. Family," I repeated. "Interesting how that only came up after you kicked me out, after you charged me rent in my own home." "You never told us it was yours," she shot back. "And if I had," I asked, "would you have treated me better or just demanded more?" She didn't answer. The silence told me enough. "You're here because of my money," I said. Because you realized you missed your chance. That's not fair, she said quietly. You're judging me without giving me a chance. I gave you 5 years of chances, I replied. Every day you could have treated me like a father, not a bank. You didn't. We stood there, the air heavy with old resentment. Finally, she turned for the car. I thought you'd be lonely and miserable, she said over her shoulder. That you'd realize you needed us. But you seem fine without us. Yes, I said, I am. She got in the car and left without goodbye. I watched her drive off feeling both sad and strangely relieved. Maybe it was the last time we'd see each other, and maybe that was for the best. The next months passed quietly. I settled into my routines, gardening, joining a book and chess club for seniors. Emily visited often sometimes for the whole weekend, talking about college and her dream of becoming a journalist. Evan called a few times always, with a thinly veiled money request. I told him my funds were already committed and his interest evaporated. Melissa never called again. Emily told me that Melissa and Noah had bought a smaller place than before, still roomy in a nice neighborhood. But their marriage had started to fray. Noah blamed Melissa for missing the gold mine by not keeping a better relationship with me. Sometimes I wondered if dropping the truth on them all at once had been the right move. Maybe I should have eased into it, given them time to accept that their father wasn't as broke as they'd thought. But then, I'd remember the calculating look in Melissa's eyes. Evan's constant greed, and I knew nothing would have changed. They just would have gotten to my money sooner. One bright spring morning, I sat on my porch with a mug of real fresh ground coffee, not the cheap instant Melissa always bought, reading the paper. I still preferred newsprint to screens, even though I'd gotten the hang of the internet and had an email account now to keep in touch with Emily. The garden I'd been tending for months was coming alive, tulips, daffodils, and early roses painting splashes of color across fresh green leaves. I had a gardener stop by weekly for the heavy work, but I handled most of the care myself. It gave me a sense of peace and purpose. The phone rang, cutting through the calm. Melissa. Odd she hadn't called in months. Why now? Another accusation, a guilt trip, or something about Emily. That last thought made me reach for the phone, but I stopped. If it were truly about Emily's safety, the hospital or police would be calling, not Melissa, who'd avoided me all this time. No more likely it was another calculated outreach. Maybe Evan had mentioned the trust I'd set up for Emily, or maybe Noah was in money trouble and they wanted Rich Dad to help. I let it ring a few more seconds, then muted it and set it face down on the table. If it mattered, she could leave a message. I wasn't about to give up my morning to another round of manipulation. I went back to my coffee and the paper. The sun climbed over the garden, the air carried birdsong, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. The world kept turning unconcerned with petty family dramas, and I was part of that world again. Not a dependent old man under his daughter's thumb. Not a miserly father guarding every dime. Just Frank Walker, a 77-year-old widower, finally living by his own rules, no longer pretending. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. That freedom was worth more than every dollar I'd ever earned or lost. The phone stopped ringing. I turned the page, sipped my coffee, and smiled at the day ahead.